Just a disclaimer, the opinions expressed in this podcast are our own views and views of our guests. Nothing in this podcast is to be taken as legal advice.
LexisNexis is a proud sponsor of That's Just Criminal podcast. Remember, AI won't replace lawyers, but lawyers using AI will. Make LexisNexis your preferred legal AI research and productivity technology partner. Find out more at lexisnexis.co.nz. The That's Just Criminal podcast is proudly sponsored by the Criminal Bar Association of New Zealand. The CBA was set up in 1984 and provides support and collegiality to criminal practitioners in New Zealand, whether they are defence lawyers, prosecutors, judges, academics or students. For more information visit www.criminalbar.org.nz. Now let's get on with the episode.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, and welcome to That's Just Criminal. I'm Annabel Cresswell, Defence Barrister and Head of Pahutakawa Chambers.
And I'm Sumudu Thode, the Principal of Thode Atting & Co, Barristers and Solicitors.
Our topic for today, which is the election to give or to call evidence. We want to talk a little bit from our own perspectives about how we make that call, and then we want to hear how other barristers do it in other parts of the country. So for the listeners, the decision whether to give or to call evidence is one of the most important trial decisions that is made. And it's one of the decisions that's made by the defendant, but it's also one that we have to help them along. It is the Crown that has to prove the case against the defendant, and they have to bring their case. At the end of the Crown case, when they've brought all their evidence and they say this is what proves the guilt, then the defendant has a decision. He has a point in time in that trial where he says he is allowed to elect whether he will call any evidence, any witnesses, produce anything, or whether he's going to get into the witness box himself and tell his side of the story. Now, on some occasions, they've already spoken to police, and so their version of events might already be before the court. But on many occasions, it's up to them, and there's that crucial decision we have to make in the heat of the battle. Sumudu, how do you go about doing it?
Well, see, the starting point is the right to silence. So even from arrest right through till trial, a defendant doesn't have to say or do anything. But we all know that the reality is very different, because there are times when, not legally, but practically speaking, you have to give your side of the story. You have to explain yourself or explain something you've said previously.
We never get to know what happens in the jury room. We don't know why juries come to the point that they do. And we spend half our lives wondering why they have reached the verdict that they reached. And was it because he didn't give evidence, or was it because he or she did give evidence that they won or lost that particular trial? So we're operating almost entirely on guesswork. I used to think if I believe my client, the jury will believe my client. And so I used to think, if he seems to me like he's telling the truth, I'm going to get him in. I don't know if many of you remember back to the Serial podcast, which first came out, but it was one of the very first true crime podcasts where they looked into somebody who had been convicted and was sitting in prison. And it turned out he may or may not have actually committed the crime he was doing time for. And they managed to interview jurors in that podcast. And the jurors said, we convicted him because we didn't understand why he didn't get in the box, look us in the eye, and tell us he didn't do it if he didn't do it. That really resonated with me. So for a long time, I'd put them in the box and think the jury will believe them because I believe them. But over time, and I'll give you some examples, I changed my view on that. What about you, Sumudu?
I'm mostly in favour of my clients giving evidence. I think you are absolutely right. The juries want to hear the client's side of the story. They want explanations. They want to gauge what they're like. They want to just see how they react to questions and under pressure. They just want to get a gauge of what this person is like, if they're the kind of person who's done these crimes that the Crown say that they have. But the other side of this is that as a lawyer, it's about appeal-proofing the case as well, because the election issue is one of the most appealed decisions when you look at Court of Appeal, High Court and Supreme Court decisions.
So just explain what you mean by appeal proof.
Well, The clients get one opportunity to give their side of the story in a trial. They can't change their mind later and say, oh, I should have given my side of the story, and ask to come back to court another time in front of that same jury or judge and explain themselves because they didn't like the outcome. Or they can't turn around and say, oh, I shouldn't have given evidence, but I did, and I now want to change my mind. So it is the most important decision. And as a lawyer, it's one of those things that clients then appeal against your advice that you've given to them. For example, they can say, my lawyer told me not to give evidence, I didn't give evidence, and I was convicted. And as a lawyer, you then have to respond to another lawyer who is going to want to go through your file, get affidavit evidence, potentially cross-examine you, and question your decision-making process right throughout.
But ultimately, when we say appeal proofing, we mean the higher courts, if they look at this trial and think, did something go wrong? Was there a miscarriage of justice? We're making sure that the thing that went wrong was not them giving evidence when they shouldn't or not giving evidence when they should. But the problem is there's no rules and there's no way to tell for sure. So I changed my view. And after calling them for a while, I had some really bad experiences. And I don't know if you've got some as well, Sumudu, that you want to share. But I've had clients that I know are innocent. We've got evidence we're about to call in their defence that absolutely showed that they were 100% telling the truth. This was going to get them off the case. And then they, in a practice run, go to explain their side of the story. And even though you know they're telling the truth, they can sound like they're confused or changing their story, or they're somewhat inarticulate, or they're hesitant, or they forget bits, and they come across like they sound like they're lying. And I've started to go, there's too much risk that you're going to sound like you're lying even though you're not. I've also had one guy who was incredibly upset all the time, would cry at the thought of having committed the crime they'd said he'd done. And I thought, if this jury see how upset he is, they can hear him cry and sniffle, they might feel compassion for him like I do. But when he got in the witness box, he started swinging around with his arm over the back of the chair, laughing and sniggering about the complainant, and made himself sound like a real arrogant cockbag. You can cut that out. I just couldn't think of another word right then. And so again, I started to think it's not always cut and dried. There's so many other things that you have to consider.
Absolutely. Look, there's so much that plays into somebody giving evidence. There's the pressure of trial, and it might be something they've never done before. They may have never been in a courtroom before, explaining themselves to strangers. The subject matter that you're talking about, it could be really embarrassing to talk about. There's cultural aspects that play into that as well.
I think there are sometimes people that would rather be found guilty than say they're guilty. So they'd actually go through the whole trial and make someone else say that they're guilty, like the jury, than plead guilty themselves, even though there's obvious advantages to pleading guilty well before trial.
Absolutely. And it's the subject matter. For example, I had a young client who was about 17, 18, charged with sexual violence offending, and he had to give evidence about erectile dysfunction. And it was not something that he wanted to talk about in front of strangers at that age and that stage of his life. For him, he would rather have not given evidence than explain what was actually happening at the time, which made perfect sense.
Little side anecdote, my father is a specialist urologist and has given evidence in court about erectile dysfunction, and that's not something you ever want to hear your dad talk about either. But my dad used to write a men's health column for the Herald when I was in my early 20s. And my friends just thought it was the funniest thing. They'd be like, I see your dad is writing about erections in the paper again today, Chris. So, wanted to die. Yeah. I'd like to introduce Wayne. Sumudu, can you tell us a little bit about Wayne McKean, our guest in the studio today?
Well, all I can say is Wayne likes drinking, and I don't think I should say that.
Just make it up.
Look, he's good with his dancing shoes and he can drink.
Let's lead with that intro and then go into what does he do for a living. Where does Wayne work, Sumudu?
So Wayne is a criminal defence lawyer in Te Tai Tokerau. He's been a criminal defence lawyer for about 30 years. He's practiced in England and in Wales, and then as a Crown prosecutor and now a defence lawyer for about 20 years in Aotearoa. Wayne is a managing director of WRMK, which is a law firm based in Whangarei.
Wayne, welcome. It's great to have you here. You've heard Sumudu and I discussing this election. Do you have a particular process that you use to make these decisions?
Yeah, my general approach is don't call your client. I think more trials have been lost by calling your client than won. And I explain that to the client. I generally say that we can control what they'll say in preparation for trial. I can control what they'll say when I ask them questions. But there comes a point in the trial where I have to sit down and someone else stands up and asks questions. And at that point, we lose control. So my process is, if you can, try and win it without. That's obviously not an easy thing to do, but that's something that's worth pursuing. And that's not just my personal view. I know when I was at the Crown, we often talked about why would, defence counsel call their clients, and that view has been expressed to me by quite senior Crown prosecutors recently, who's people that I have known for a long time, who still say they just can't understand why some counsel call their clients. The real problem is if there's an experienced Crown prosecutor who's prosecuting your client, even with the smallest amount of ammunition, they can cause real damage.
Don't you think, though, that Crown prosecutors, if they're not really experienced, they're not that good at cross-examination, so you don't need to worry about that so much?
There's no doubt about it that I throw into the mix who's going to do the questioning from the prosecution department. Generally, if we're doing sex trials, it's an experienced Crown prosecutor, and that favours not. Now, I'll talk a bit about why you have to change. You've got to be prepared to call your person, but I'm talking about my preference. But if you have a case where the prosecuting counsel is intermediate junior, that is certainly a reason to change your position or say, well, I'm confident you'll perform well because you know that particular prosecutor's not that good at it. And there's certainly a big difference between different counsel.
LexisNexis is a proud sponsor of That's Just Criminal podcast. Remember, AI won't replace lawyers, but lawyers using AI will. Make LexisNexis your preferred legal AI research and productivity technology partner. Find out more at lexisnexis.co.nz. The That's Just Criminal podcast is proudly sponsored by the Criminal Bar Association of New Zealand. The CBA was set up in 1984 and provides support and collegiality to criminal practitioners in New Zealand, whether they are defence lawyers, prosecutors, judges, academics or students. For more information, visit www.criminalbar.org.nz. Now let's get back to the episode.
Wayne, you said that one of the things that go into the mix when you're making that decision as the prosecutor, what else goes into that mix when you're talking to your client about whether or not they should give evidence?
How the evidence is coming out. So sometimes you can start by saying, look, it's going to be bad for you if you give evidence, that point that you guys made before. But sometimes the evidence comes out in a way that you didn't expect. For example, the damaging stuff hasn't come out, or it hasn't come out as clearly as you thought it would, or hasn't come out at all. So you've got to throw into the mix, how's it panned out for the Crown? And I've done cases where we've made a really strong decision that this is one of those cases where you are going to have to give evidence. And then just because the Crown case changed so much in the course of the trial, we made a last-minute decision to not.
That's interesting. I often say to them, I'm not going to coach you. I'm not going to tell you what to say. I don't practice with them because I don't want them to say, well, when we practiced before, you said this, or my lawyer, and I've seen that happen to other counsel, they go, well, my lawyer said to say that if I was asked that.
Yeah.
Because I'll only put them up if I've got quite a bit of faith that they're going to be good, and then I just go, tell the truth.
I say to them, you got to do your homework. So you got to read this brief. I don't want you to read it 1,000,000 times, but I need you to read it 2 or 3 times before you give your evidence. But when you give your evidence, you've got to be who you are and you've got to use your words.
Sometimes what I do is I will go through examination in chief with the client, but I would ask another lawyer in my office to come in and do practice cross-examination with them. So it's somebody who doesn't necessarily know about the case that much, but is able to pick up on inconsistencies in what the client says or just how they answer a question and the wording they use. I get a practice run with somebody else who's not me, but just to watch, because that's all we can do in court. And sometimes it is just a train wreck.
Just going back, Sumudu, how early on in the trial do you make a decision about, or a plan more? Because we know we all have to change our minds at the last minute. We will have all had to have done that. But how early do you make a plan for whether or not they'll give evidence in their own defence?
Every jury trial I go into, there's a signed brief of evidence. I never open the door to that in my cross-examination, saying things like my client will say, but I go into every trial thinking that my client may have to give evidence. But that last-minute decision is really a last-minute decision for me. It's at the end, once the Crown prosecutors got up and said, that's the case for the Crown, because so many things can happen in trials. We have an idea of how we think the trial is going to go, having read statements, and then what actually happens in court and how the evidence comes out, how the witnesses come out, how the cross-examination goes, completely changes the landscape of some trials. So my practice is to go into it thinking they're going to give evidence. And if they don't have to, great. If they have to, great.
What do you say about this, though? Sometimes I think if I know my client's going to, and in self-defense and things like that, sometimes they have to say, well, I hit this person back because they were coming at me, and if there's no other way to get that evidence across, I'll open on that, because I think that then the jury are waiting to hear from your client the whole way and suspending a little bit of just going straight into believing what the Crown witnesses say. So if I'm really sure, I'll open on it and say, you're going to hear from my client. It's a bit of an unusual one, but that you're hearing at this stage. But those are in cases where you're on pretty solid ground. What about you, Wayne?
I don't normally open on it in this opening statement of issues, but I sometimes in cross-examination say, well, you say that, Joe Bloggs is going to give evidence, and we'll say the opposite. What do you have to say?
And I think in some cases, especially if it's a sexual violence case, you go into it with a pretty good idea if your client has to give evidence. If it's a case where it's a he said, she said, you know that your client has to give evidence. Those kind of cases, I have no difficulty opening, saying, look, you're going to hear from the client. But I think the other thing is it really depends on whether, say, they've done a DVD interview or a statement to the police, and if the prosecution is calling that evidence. Because if you know that they've done a good interview, you've got his word through the prosecution case, and I know that I may not necessarily have to call him or her to give evidence. Every case is different, and it just depends on what evidence is there, what witnesses are there, but most importantly, how we think that our clients are going to handle the heat in what is the most important decision in a trial. Wayne, what's your process in terms of getting instructions from the client, and what do you say to the client in that crucial moment when you have to just make that call, yay or nay, giving evidence or not giving evidence?
I always say, and I say this at least 3 or 4 times to them leading up to this crucial decision. So I'll say it in the weeks before and during the trial. I say it's a really hard decision to give evidence or not. And I say, it's your decision. I can help you, and I can tell you what the risks are, and I can tell you my view on it. But it's at the end of the day, it's your decision. And you can't think later on that I wish I would have made a different decision.
What about you, Annabel? What's your process in terms of getting those final instructions from the client?
I do a little pros and cons with them. These are the advantages, these are disadvantages. I jot those down. And then if I've got a firm view and I've guided them, I'll say my lawyer has advised me, in this case, I do not need to give evidence. It's most likely that the pros outweigh the cons or the cons outweigh, and I therefore elect not to give evidence. But they almost always want help with that decision, and they want to know what we think about it.
I will give evidence, I will not give evidence, and I get the client to cross out what they don't decide and circle what they decide. So my instructions will say, my lawyers explain, right to silence, don't have to say anything. This is the state of the evidence, anything else that I need to cover. And then having considered all of this, my decision is A, I will give evidence, B, I will not give evidence. And so I get them to cross out the one that they don't want to do and circle the one that they want to do. So because for me, that shows that they've considered both options rather than just outlining it, going to one decision.
Wayne, one other thing that I've talked about with other lawyers is sometimes it can be tempting to hang your client out to dry. They want to give evidence. Some of these people can be really annoying and difficult people to deal with. And they say, I want to tell my side of the story to the jury. And they're going to be terrible. And that that's going to be the worst thing for them. I think there are some lawyers in those circumstances who sit back and go, do it then, put them up in the witness stand and just let them sink themselves. I personally think that's irresponsible. Those clients are difficult. We should be skilled enough to be able to give them strong advice and make them understand when they shouldn't give evidence as well as when they should. Do you think there are lawyers out there that would sometimes hang the clients out to dry?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do think I'm with you, Annabel. I think we've got an obligation to, when it's clear, to be firm. But at the end of the day, they have to sign off that decision. So after applying all the pressure in the world, if they say, I want to give evidence, you've got to run it. But I would find that really hard to run a case knowing that my client was going to walk into something that they'd go down and be found guilty when otherwise they wouldn't.
Crash and burn in a train wreck of screaming flames. And we've all seen that happen as well. Have you actually had that experience of watching your client and going in your head, no?
Yeah, but maybe that's justice. So maybe that's what was meant to happen. So, as long as we've given the best advice and we've prepared them well, and if they've got up there and everything's just turned to custard, and as long as, what annoys me most of all is when prosecutors engineer it unfairly, that really makes me upset. But as long as that's not happening, if they're dying in the witness box, maybe that's the way it was meant to be.
Can we make the sound of something crashing and burning? Because that is
sound effects.
That is sometimes what you're doing in your head when you're watching them. But yeah.
One of my first trials as a defense lawyer, really bad offending. And my client, whenever he was asked by the prosecutor whether he did commit this terrible thing on the complainant, horrible sexual thing, he would say, no, I didn't. And then he'd lick his lips.
Oh,
and every time he did it, it looked so bad. It was obvious to everyone that he just wasn't committed to the answers. So I do say to the client, there are some things that you need to be committed to and, that you have to die in the ditch on. Say if it's self-defense, I felt threatened or I felt at risk. Before I punched the guy, I thought he was going to hit me. There are some things you just can't give in on. They can, just help the jury out for everything else. But when it comes, there's some key points that they just can't give in on.
But you don't want them to go, in the circumstances as I perceived them to be, I felt threatened, which is for those who don't know, the wording of the legislation and what they're trying to establish.
Yeah. I think I always say to my clients, look, make the concessions that you have to. Just because a Crown prosecutor is asking you a question, you don't have to be, no, I didn't do it, no, I didn't do it, no, I didn't do it. You don't have to disagree with them. If there's concessions that need to be made, just make the concessions because you come across more believable. Because if you're arguing about every point, then even when you say no to something, then the jury may just go, well, you say no to everything. Was the sky blue? No. So make the concessions you have to, but stick to the core story that you know.
A good prosecutor as well is going to close to the jury by saying that witness was clearly lying. You could tell by the way they made absolutely no concessions, and a normal witness will make a concession. So that's very sensible advice anyway, because that's what they're going to be faced with.
I think it's because I had one client who answered every question with, I don't recall, I don't recall, I don't recall. This is despite having a signed brief of evidence that showed he clearly recalled. So every question was, I don't recall. And it just came across so badly when, so,
Worse than licking their lips?
It was a train wreck. Or the clients that, there's cell phone footage and GPS data that shows where they were moving. And they swore that they went from A to B when the cell phone footage and GPS records show that they actually went a completely different way. But there are some clients that just don't understand the importance of a piece of evidence or what they say and how that could just completely sink the defense case and just help the prosecutor in one sentence. In one sentence, they can just completely sink your case. And clients don't understand the importance of that sometimes.
Can you make the sound of the Titanic going down?
Well, sometimes to a client, it's about having their day in court. It's about telling their story. It's about just having that moment. And that's not what the trial process is about. It's striking that balance in terms of them having their day in court and balancing that against our obligations as a lawyer.
Them having their many, many days in prison. Wayne, thank you very much for coming on our podcast today and for sharing your experiences and war stories with us. We look forward to having you on the show again soon.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, Wayne.
Cheers. See you guys.
Just to be clear, the decision whether to give or call evidence is the client and the client's alone. We as lawyers can only give advice and lay out the options, the pros and cons, and answer any question. The ultimate decision is not ours.
What was your one takeaway from that discussion, Sumudu?
My takeaway is that we all do things differently. And it was interesting because I'm very much I call my client stance initially, and then Wayne is the complete opposite. So we all have different ways of doing exactly the same job. And it doesn't mean that one way is right or wrong.
I don't know how it's going to sound, but I thought Wayne had quite a nice radio voice. What do you think?
I did say when you're like, why should we get him? I was like, oh, he's got a nice voice. Thank you for listening and subscribe to That's Just Criminal wherever you listen to your podcast.
Thank you for being part of our barrister life here on That's Just Criminal.